General Motors, a global automotive giant, now sells more cars in China than it does in its home market, the United States. Interestingly, the leading electric vehicle in the world at the moment is also from China, and it is produced by a company that many of you might not be familiar with, BYD Corporation. If you're not familiar with BYD, you're not alone. It's one of those companies that flies under the radar, despite its significant impact on the industry. The name BYD stands for Build Your Dream, which is quite fitting when you consider the remarkable progress they've made. The real twist to the story, however, lies in how this company has created the world's best electric vehicles at a price that outshines competitors. It is not just the innovation and technology behind the cars that makes BYD stand out, it is the affordability that has positioned these vehicles as the top choice globally. But here's where the plot thickens. About 3 weeks ago, a major financial shift occurred. Corporations and wealthy individuals began signaling to the government that they were no longer willing to extend credit, citing the nation's overwhelming debt as the main concern. They stated, "You've borrowed too much and you're too risky to lend to anymore." This move has marked a significant turning point in the relationship between China's government and its financial backers, adding a new layer of complexity to an already intricate economic scenario. Who's behind all this lending to the United States government? It's Japan, the single largest creditor. In fact, Japan is now the country that holds the most debt from the U.S. government, surpassing all other nations. Let me break this down for you. It's time for a quick lesson in what we call high finance, though. As you'll see, it's actually pretty straightforward once you understand the basics. At the heart of it, the U.S. government is the most indebted government on the planet. No one else even comes close. But here's the thing: who actually lends money to the U.S. government? Well, it doesn't really matter to them. The lenders can be anyone: individuals, companies, banks, both domestic and foreign. That's why Japan stands at the top of the list. Now, here's something you might not expect. The second largest creditor to the U.S. government isn't some small nation, it's none other than China, just a little behind Japan. This brings us to an interesting point if you're trying to grasp the relationship between the U.S. and China, especially when it comes to global financial dynamics. The U.S. is in debt, and China is in a far better position as the creditor. This is an important detail for understanding the broader global picture, especially when you look at their political alliances. China, for example, is allied with Russia, siding with them in the ongoing war in Ukraine, while the U.S. is supporting Ukraine against Russia. So, how does the United States manage to pay for this ongoing war? Well, they have two primary ways to fund it, and that's what we need to explore next. There's a straightforward way for the U.S. government to pay for wars. Taxation. Imagine receiving a letter from Uncle Sam, or in this case, Uncle Don, saying, "Hey, we're fighting a very expensive war in Ukraine, and I'll need an extra $4,628 from you this year, maybe next year too. Have a nice day." That would certainly put a halt to the war real quick, wouldn't it? But here is the problem: we don't fund wars through taxes because the American people wouldn't stand for it. Instead, we borrow the money to fund wars, which means we can continue without immediately putting the financial burden on citizens. We've done this for wars in Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, and now Ukraine, but we can only borrow until the lenders say no more. And that's exactly what Japan has done. This leads to an odd situation. China, which is allied with Russia and supporting their stance in the war in Ukraine, is also one of the largest creditors of the U.S., lending money that helps finance the U.S. military actions against Russia. It's a confusing and paradoxical scenario, and you need to really keep track of which team is on which side in this global financial game. At the moment, the U.S. is facing a massive debt, about $35 trillion, while its annual output of goods and services is roughly $25 trillion. It is like the worst relative in your family who has maxed out 11 credit cards and is struggling to get approved for a 12th. We're in deep trouble. And what's happening in response? Well, politicians like Mr. Trump, who represent the conservative side of things, are doing what they always do when their management of the system has led to chaos. They start laying blame and cutting costs. So we're seeing layoffs, including thousands of workers at the CDC Center for Disease Control. And what does this mean for the future? If another pandemic strikes, it could be far worse, as we won't be as prepared to manage it. Similarly, agencies like the Food and Drug Administration are feeling the pinch as well. The system is in trouble, and the consequences are piling up. When you drink milk and it tastes a little off, it's likely because 11 sheep had a hand in it, and trust me, you don't want to know what happened. Laughter, but that's the reality when we're cutting budgets across the board. The lack of personnel means fewer checks, and the quality control is slipping. But let's shift gears for a moment. Hear us a little footnote. General Motors is now selling more cars in China than it does in the United States. And guess what? The best electric car in the world right now is made in China by a company called BYD. Sound unfamiliar? That's because most people, especially in the US, have never heard of it. And that's telling. BYD stands for Build Your Dream, which is ironic, considering they've managed to create the world desktop electric vehicles at a price that undercuts all competitors. For over a decade, there's been fierce competition to build the best electric car to replace gas-burning vehicles, and the winner of that competition? A Chinese company. Now, how did the United States respond to this? By excluding them. Mr. Trump started with a 27% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles, and under President Biden, that was raised to 100%. So here is the deal. If you want to buy a $30,000 electric car or truck from China, you can send $30,000 to China and have the vehicle shipped to you. But if you want to pick it up at the dock, you'll have to pay an additional 100% tariff too. Uncle Sam, which adds another $30,000 to the final price. That's why you won't see BYD trucks and cars on the roads in America, even though they're everywhere in Europe. Why? Because Europeans are willing to buy the best car at the lowest price, but in the US, tough luck, you don't get that option. So who benefits from this? General Motors, Ford, and Tesla, of course. They're the ones protected because they manufacture their cars outside of China. But it's American consumers who are the victims of these trade policies. And it doesn't stop there. Mr. Trump's aggressive economic policies have created serious damage globally. Every country now knows that their market in the United States is in jeopardy. Americans will now have to pay a tax to Uncle Sam if they want to buy French wine, Belgian chocolate, computer parts, or Apple phones. The global economic balance is shifting, and it's not in America's favor. Everything is made in China, folks. And if this keeps going, even your morning latte at Starbucks could cost you $25. How often are you going to be able to afford that? Starbucks is in a panic as their business shrinks because the average person just can't afford to go anymore. We are heading towards a future that looks a lot like what we used to see in National Geographic documentaries, with a small group of rich people in fancy cities surrounded by a sea of poverty. That's where we're headed. It's becoming more obvious every day. For people like me, it's getting harder to talk about this without sounding too grim. Some of you may already look a bit down, and I get it. It's a tough reality. The United States is part of a group called the G7, which used to be the powerhouse of the world. This group includes the United States, Canada, Japan, Britain, France, Italy, and Germany. If you add up the total output of goods and services from the G7, it represents about 28% of the world's total output, but there's another group that's now surpassing that, the BRICS countries, BRICS, which originally included Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, has now expanded to include 18 other nations. Together, the BRICS group now contributes about 35% of global output, which is already a much bigger economic force than the G7. The balance of power has shifted. The United States is no longer the central economic engine it once was. Every country in the world is re-evaluating its position politically, economically, militarily, and ideologically. Companies with international business are trying to figure out what this new reality means for them, and countries in Africa, for example, are now grappling with how to fund crucial infrastructure projects like building the railroads they need to boost their economies. The global economic landscape is changing, and the old order is no longer as dominant as it once was. In the past, people used to flock to New York, London, or Paris for their business or leisure trips. They still go to those cities, but increasingly, after their stay in the West, they're heading to places like New Delhi, Beijing, and Sao Paulo. And what are they doing there? They're asking, who's offering me the better deal? And more often than not, they're going with the better deal. That's why today, most of the railroads in Africa are built by China. Why are so many ports emerging along the coasts of Latin America developed by the Chinese? It's not just your everyday products, it's everywhere. China's influence is sprawling into every corner of the globe, and it's not stopping anytime soon. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, a Western organization that certainly can't be accused of left-wing bias, recently reported that the U.S. economy grew by 2.8% in 2024. Outpacing all other G7 countries. But here's the kicker. The IMF also tells us that China grew at 5%, double the US rate, and India, another member of the BRICS group, grew by 7%. The gap between China and the United States, which was already tilted in China's favor, is widening even further. The United States is scrambling to find a coherent strategy, and tariffs? They're essentially a joke at this point. The U.S. continues to implement tariffs against China, hoping to contain them economically. Sound familiar? It's the same rhetoric we heard during the Cold War when the Soviet Union was the perceived threat. Back in the post-World War II era, George Kennan came up with the containment plan for the Soviet Union. The strategy was simple. Encircle them with military bases, create alliances around them, enter NATO, and bring them to their knees economically. And that's exactly what happened with the Soviet Union. But now the US is applying the same strategy to China, calling it a new Cold War. But economically, this is a huge mistake. Why? Because the relationship between the US and China is completely different from that of the US and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was never an economic competitor to the United States. China, on the other hand, is not only an economic competitor but also a rising global power with deep ties across the world, making the Cold War strategy utterly outdated and economically dangerous. Let's break this down. When we talk about the GDP, gross domestic product of the United States, we're looking at around $25 to $26 trillion. Now compare that to Russia, the inheritor of the Soviet Union, whose economy is between $3 and $4 trillion. Do you get the picture? 25 trillion versus 3 or 4 trillion, this is an elephant and a mouse in terms of economic power. Russia may have had nuclear weapons and military might, but economically, not even close. Russia was never an economic challenge for the US, that was never a real issue. But China is completely different. China is an economic powerhouse and a competitor in ways Russia never was. Just look at your toaster. It likely says made in China. That's because they manufacture everything. And what does the US make? Well, almost nothing at this point. I'm exaggerating, of course, but you get the idea. The businesses in the US moved there for one simple reason: profit. That's how capitalism works. The Japanese, Europeans, and US businesses all went to China to maximize profits, and now we're left to deal with the results. And here's the thing, the companies that went to China didn't just make a small profit, they made a huge profit. This shift started becoming significant in the 1970s and 1982, and we saw the stock market in the US performing well throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, and even into the present. If you were part of the stock market, you reaped the rewards of that profit, but if you weren't, well, you didn't benefit. The wealthiest 10% of Americans own 80-85 of all stocks. Unless you're in that group, you didn't get your share of those profits. This, then, is the real issue. The United States is facing its first serious economic competitor in over a century, and that's why the world feels different today, if you want to understand. Why Xi Jinping, the leader of China, can stand up to Trump and essentially tell him where to go. It's simple, he can. He has the economic and political power to do so, and that's why we're in a different world now.